Well, thank you very much, Mr. President, for your introduction. It's a real pleasure to sit here under your charge. Our paths have crossed quite often, always in positive terms, when we struggled with the insoluble problem of Cyprus and when we met up just before the bad things were starting to happen in Ukraine. But it's a great pleasure to be here. As Martin Howe has said, we disagree, he and I, quite fundamentally on these issues. And I would only say to those who are not cognoscenti of the English language that when you hear a Briton using the words common market to describe the European Union, you know which side he's on. Anyway, the parameters of the subject that you at the Foundation chose for this European dialogue, when you first invited me to speak, was in fact last January, have changed pretty dramatically in the intervening period. And I'm not going to try and give anything like a history of Britain's fairly turbulent relationship with the other member states, because that would take me way beyond the 10 minutes that allotted to me. I'm going to try and concentrate on what's likely to occur in the months and year or two ahead. Now, following the general election in Britain on the 7th of May, the question of whether or not we would have an in-out referendum on Britain's EU membership before the end of 2017 is no longer an open one. The party committed to holding such a referendum won an overall majority in the House of Commons, and British constitutional practice implies that that mandate will be respected and that the necessary legislation, because we do not have powers to hold referendums in our constitutional practice unless Parliament makes those powers. And so on each occasion, Scotland, alternative vote, or now in or out of Europe, legislation has to be passed. So for better or for worse, there will be such a referendum, even if many of the arguments against holding one, above all our tradition of a preference for representative parliamentary democracy over plebiscitary democracy, I hardly dare say that here, but still, we do have that preference, the risk that a referendum will not, in fact, settle the matter of Britain's EU membership once and for all too likely. Look at what's going on over Scotland now. The likelihood that many of the votes cast will be motivated by factors far removed from the issues raised by that membership, those haven't really been properly addressed. But the die has now been cast, and a referendum we will have. Moreover, the relatively slow-paced timetable for holding the referendum before the end of 2017 is now under quite stiff challenge, both from the pro-European and from the Eurosceptic ends of the political spectrum. The awkwardness of bringing these matters to a head in a period when both France and Germany are holding elections and when the UK is in the EU presidency seems to have dawned, a trifle belatedly, on the government which chose the date in the first place. It was in the Prime Minister's Bloomberg speech a couple of years ago. Whether it will prove realistic to try to telescope the timetable very dramatically is, however, an open question which I would hesitate to try and answer categorically. There are an awful lot of moving parts in this particular bit of machinery, both domestically and internationally, and they will need to be successfully synchronized for that to be achieved. What is not in doubt is that the British Prime Minister is likely to want to keep open the option of a shorter timetable by initiating a negotiating process as early as this month's meeting of the European Council. What will the period ahead and that process look like? Well, I suggest that it will very broadly fall into two parts. In the first part, there will be two parallel processes. They'll run parallel to each other. One involving negotiations between the member states within the European institutions the other the passing of the UK legislation needed before a referendum can be held. Now, both those processes will be contentious and complex. And then the second part, because that's the first part, the second part will consist of the referendum campaign itself, although you may think, watching the BBC and reading the British press, that it started already, and in a sense it has. But the second part will be the referendum campaign itself, which will be largely a British affair, although others, the other member states and the rest of the world, will no doubt have a major interest in its outcome. And judging by comments that have been made from those as far apart as President Obama and Prime Ministers of Commonwealth countries, they have a major interest in the outcome, and of course do our partners in the European Union, who also are beginning to speak up on the subject. Now, what will be the scope of the negotiations that will be undertaken? Clearly, we need to wait for the Prime Minister to set out his stall. But here are one or two guidelines which I would suggest you could judge the negotiability of what he suggests. First, whether what he is seeking are reforms for the European Union as a whole, with an appeal to other member states than just the UK, or whether they are simply addressed to what can be called British exceptionalism. In the first category would fall many of the items already identified in last June's European Council strategic agenda for the next 5 years: completion of the single market, including services, energy and the digital economy, trade and investment agreements with the US, with Japan and India, a greater role for national parliaments in shaping EU legislation, safeguards for the integrity of the single market as European integration moves ahead particularly, of course, in terms of the members of the Eurozone, and some formalization of last year's recognition, and that was agreed explicitly and rather eloquently in last June's European Council conclusions, that this phrase, quote, ever closer union, which is in the preamble to the original treaty, is not a straitjacket compelling member states to accept more decentralized decisions. Second consideration, I think you might judge the chances of success on, are whether what is sought does or does not require fundamental treaty change, and does or does not challenge the 4 basic freedoms on which the European Union's single market is based. That would not exclude some changes in access to national welfare benefits, which would address some of the concerns over immigration. And third, and perhaps most important of the criteria, whether the British government can convince its partners that should a satisfactory negotiated outcome be achieved, they will campaign wholeheartedly for Britain to remain in the EU as a fully committed and constructive member state. And on that point, I do very much disagree with Martin Howe. I think the idea that that there are no longer anybody who believes that Britain's membership of the European Union is in our and the European Union's interest is not correct, but I'm prepared to wait till the outcome of the referendum to get the answer to that. Then there is the referendum legislation, which is the second and parallel part of what I was talking about, which will be going on starting last week in the House of Commons, continuing tomorrow and on Thursday at the committee stage. Will the question to be put be unbiased in the eyes of the non-political electoral commission that we have? I think that the text now tabled by the government, which is a very different text from the text that was tabled in a private member's bill 2 years ago, will in fact meet that criterion of being unbiased and objective. Who will get to vote? 16 and 17-year-olds. They voted in the Scottish referendum, but they are not provided for in this legislation. All British citizens living in other member states whose basic rights, after all, will be affected by the outcome of the referendum, also not covered in this legislation unless they've lived for less than 15 years in another member state. EU citizens resident in the UK, again, in the case of Scotland, they got the vote in the Scottish referendum last year. Again, they are not included in the present text of the legislation. Those are all quite big issues. And much more will need to be debated and decided by Parliament in the months ahead, as will the need, and here this will be quite a difficult one, I think, to crack, for the government to set out what the alternative they would pursue would be if the electorate were to vote no, that we did not wish to stay in. It's, after all, not entirely reasonable to expect to have a free and fair referendum if you don't tell people what would happen if they voted in a particular way. There'll be no difficulty about telling them what will happen if they vote yes, but there is a difficulty about what will happen if they vote no, partly because the people who want to vote no don't agree amongst themselves about what should happen. And then there would be a need also to find some way of providing objective material for the electorate to try to understand the issues at stake. These are hugely complicated, quite far-reaching, and you cannot expect either of the two campaigns to provide totally unbiased information. They won't. That's not what they're there for. But it would be a very good thing if somebody did, and if the government had an obligation to ensure that somebody does. We have something called the Office for the Budgetary Responsibility, which is an entirely objective body and which assesses the budget each year and tells it as it is. And a body like that could do that. So this will not be an entirely straightforward process, this legislative process, and it could have important implications for the referendum itself. But don't get me wrong, this is not a time-wasting exercise. In my view, the legislation will be on the statute book by about Christmas or shortly thereafter. And then there will be the campaign itself, which will certainly be hotly contested, not because most British voters rate EU membership among the top 5 issues of concern to them. Ironically, whenever they are asked that question, they say it's not. And they produce a lot of other things, which no doubt in this country too would come much higher up the list, like health and education and so on. But because it'll be contested, because the protagonists on both sides of the argument, who make up a large proportion of what we call the political class, most of whom, by the way, like the previous speaker, know already how they're going to vote before the debate has started, will ensure that it is hotly contested. That debate will not and should not be just about the value of the reforms which will have been agreed in Brussels, but about much wider issues concerning Britain's European future, in or out of the EU, and its role in the world, all of which will be fundamentally influenced by the outcome of this referendum. There will be positive arguments addressed on both sides, and there will be negative arguments. Experience drawn from the Scottish referendum last year tells us that those negative arguments can be pretty influential. It was, after all, the uncertainties surrounding the question of the currency following a vote for Scottish independence, and the viability of the revenue forecasts for an independent Scotland, which were complete baloney, because they were based on an oil price of $120 a barrel, which is now half that. These negative arguments were every bit as important as the emotional arguments in favour of maintaining the Union in Scotland, which helped to win the day. Now, one of the main weaknesses of those who advocate Britain leaving the EU is, as I said, they cannot agree amongst themselves what the best alternatives to membership would be, nor can they be at all sure whether any such alternative that they hit upon would would in fact be negotiable with those other European countries who would have to agree to it. Many of the supposed benefits of leaving would be cancelled out by the commitments needed to retain access to the single market. That would be the case if Britain were to opt for the Norwegian or the Swiss model of relationship. And many of the supposed budgetary savings would be offset by the need to reinvent national programs, for example, for agricultural support, regional support, social support, and to encourage scientific research, on which we benefit hugely from the European programs, quite out of proportion to the size of the country. And the reaction so far of our friends and allies around the world, far beyond the boundaries of the European Union, to the prospect of possible British exit from the EU, which have been uniformly negative, do not encourage the view that they would welcome or reward any such decision to leave. You will notice, I'm sure, that I have not sought in these remarks to answer the basic question posed in your title today for this European dialogue, whether the UK will be in or out of the European Union when the die is cast. To do so would, I think, be both presumptuous and complacent. But I am certainly not indifferent to the outcome of the referendum to which we are now committed. It is my own view that both the UK and its other European partners would be seriously damaged by a British decision to leave, that both parties would see their influence in the world reduced and their prosperity undermined. When all is said and done, it is my view that Britain is ethnically, culturally, geographically, and historically a European country, and we need to play an active and positive role in shaping Europe's future, and not to retreat into sulky marginalization. So there is the counterpoint of view set out, but not in great detail. No doubt in the months to come, you will all hear a lot more of that detail, and maybe slightly more than you would wish to hear.